Hello, and welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Caroline Roberts, and before we start this episode, I want to thank all of you new listeners for tuning in last week when we began the rename of this podcast. This podcast used to be called Radio Free Acton up until last week when we released the new name Acton Line. When we did that, we saw a huge uptick in our listeners, and I want to thank you all for joining us. At the top of this show, I'll first be speaking with Sarah Estelle. She's a professor of economics at Hope College, and she'll be joining me to talk about the economics of loving. This conversation is in preparation for her upcoming lecture series event here at the Acton Institute on February 14. She'll consider in what cases market exchange can communicate love, and in which situations market approaches would only crush it. To join us for the event, which will take place tomorrow by this time the podcast episode releases, you can swing over to acton.org/events and register there. After that, Andrew Vanderput, the Poverty Initiatives Manager here at Acton, will be speaking with Scott Sabin, the Executive Director of Plant with Purpose. Plant with Purpose's programs equip farming families around the world to increase farm yields, heal damaged ecosystems, improve nutrition, and increase household savings and opportunities. This integrated approach solves two major issues facing the world today: environmental degradation and rural poverty. Andrew and Scott will be talking about how they practically approach the savings groups and how what they do furthers both the environment and poverty alleviation. If you want to learn more about Plant with Purpose, you can always visit plantwithpurpose.org. Also, if you're a regular listener of Acton Line and you like what you hear, please do not forget to swing over to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating. And last but not least, if you have any friends or family who would like listening to Acton Line, don't forget to share it with them. Let them know why you like Acton Line and where they can listen. You can subscribe to Acton Line on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, or any other podcast directory that you like. To be economically literate does not require advanced study. The most valuable economic principles can be understood with just a little nurturing of the so-called economic way of thinking. On February 14, Sarah Estelle, professor of economics at Hope College here in Holland, Michigan, will share how she sees the economic way of thinking as instructive in some of the ways we can love too. What does economics have to say about our love for mankind, our neighbors around the globe, and our local communities and families? Today, I'm joined in the studio with Sarah to speak more about her upcoming event here at the Acton Institute and answer a few questions I have about her upcoming talk. Sarah, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me again.
I am going to start out with some of the most basic questions on the subject. I remember before I attended Acton University, almost, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, I was completely intimidated by any talk surrounding economics. I thought that if I am not an economics major, and since I am not too swift at math, I should hesitate from broaching the subject at all. But after I was exposed to a few basic classes and was encouraged to kind of break down the definitions, I realized that it really just boils down to an understanding of the basic economic principles. So my first question has to do with essentially, how do you define economics? What is economics?
So for me, when I meet someone or the first day of an intro economics class, the one thing I want to make sure people understand is that economics is just a careful approach to thinking about human behavior. So first, I want to define economics in a way that opens it up to many different applications, right? That people can see purpose in understanding it. And I like that definition for that fact. Not just because it's accurate as well, right? That it is really a study of human behavior. So that's, day one, intro economics class. That's what I want to leave students with. And then I encourage them to think, how do we narrow that down, or what makes economics different than other social sciences that might say the same thing, that they're a study of human behavior. And so I think one dimension of economics is its scope. And I think sometimes there is a misunderstanding of the scope of economics. We actually narrow it too much. It has a much broader applicability than we might think. I think what makes economics particularly useful is the perspective, really the methodology. I heard a Christian economist, Ken Elzinga at the University of Virginia, describe economists as people as not being pessimists, not being optimists, but thinking of ourselves kind of as realists. And I hope that doesn't sound arrogant at all. I think there's a humility there. But I think what he's trying to say is that we don't just consider the benefits of a particular policy, let's say, or a particular activity, but we do want to think about the costs as well. That more education may sound good, but it might have to come at the expense of less healthcare. Right? Or if we build a park, then maybe we don't have, a skating rink or a garden when we've got this open green area, that there are trade-offs. And I think this perspective of economics is an important way to think about what economics is.
So your talk is called The Economic Ways of Loving. Considering that, what in the world does loving or just even altruism, maybe in general, have to do with economics?
I think actually economists could be thrown off by that question or find that a new thing to consider. How do we even operationalize love? Put it in practical enough terms that an economist could think about it within the scope of our discipline. I first thought of this a few years ago when I heard Michael Matheson Miller give a talk on effective poverty alleviation. And he was speaking about love in that context. And he drew on a quote from Aquinas, which was to define love as to will the good of the other. And I can't recall if I'd heard that quote before. I understand now that it's actually part of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's a well-known quote in some circles, but when I heard it, I immediately thought, this is so practical. Right? Love isn't a feeling, it's an action, it has a purpose, it has a subject, right? The other, not an object, but a subject. And then I thought this is also very practical for thinking from an economic perspective. One of the aspects of economic thinking is to consider the consequences of our actions and to understand that good intentions aren't the same thing as beneficial outcomes, that there's more than just good intentions. And so when we think of willing the good of the other, not our feelings and how we approach the other, not our intentions and how we approach the other, but are we doing good? I think economics has something to say about the consequences of our actions. Economics also would cause us to think carefully about how we can do good to various people, right? To think of the other and to consider their uniqueness, the differences. Economics teaches us about different comparative advantages, which is just the idea that we all have different skill sets, that we might have different preferences. I think there are theological reasons to recognize the diversity in people, but I think economics has a number of tools as well that draw on the beautiful diversity of people in the world. And then the last thing I think is to recognize, and I really want to build on this in my lecture on February 14th, is to recognize that to do good to the benefit of someone else really requires us to know something about them. And so if I know different things about you, Caroline, than I do my husband, than I do my so-called neighbor on the other side of the world, right? I can love you all theoretically and even with some sense of emotion, but how I do good to each of you, depending on the distance of our relationship, right, and the kind of knowledge I have access to is going to be different. And that's the basic premise for my lecture.
What are the biggest misconceptions you would say about economics?
So I would say number one, top of the list, is that economics is about money. Certainly there are all sorts of money-related topics within economics, but it's frankly a small set of the vast array of things that we can do with the economic way of thinking. Economics isn't just about money or financial decisions or certainly the stock market. Economists have ideas on these things, but it goes so much further. Let me try to give an example there. I've got some research on women's decisions of how to invest in their children. Now, not in terms of money, but in terms of time, and in particular, conversation, in this case, about adolescent sexual activity. And I'm interested in the consequences of those investments in the children. A sociologist might say, well, we can handle that. A psychologist might say, well, we know something about that. But actually, economics has a particular view to bring to that question. And money's not really a factor in those sorts of parenting decisions. So I think economics, the first misconception is that it's got a limited scope. The second misconception is something you alluded to before. I think many people have the experience of thinking that economics is just too technical. right? That a non-economist is going to have a hard time getting much out of it because we know it's highly mathematical, works with a lot of data frequently. And I happen to be a fan of the fact that economics is pretty technical within academia, but I'm also a proponent for economists and economic thinkers to really spread the message that economics is broadly applicable and also accessible. You can trust, I think, to a large degree what's going on in the economic discipline to give us some good tests of basic economic thinking, but you don't have to be able to do those tests yourself or critique those tests to understand the first principles that, frankly, we've known many of those for hundreds of years, and we're just still struggling to get the word out. The last thing I'll say is that sometimes there's a misconception that economics is immoral, and I think that might be related to the first idea that economics is all about money. And people of all sorts of different persuasions kind of get, their skin kind of crawls when they think about money in certain ways. And so economics, people who would want to study that even maybe are a bit immoral. I think economics is an objective set of tools, which causes us to recognize that it's limited in what it can say. It can't choose our values for us. But if you have a strong set of values, a strong set a clear idea of your objectives, economics as an objective science can help you to understand how to achieve those things.
Do you think that economists themselves sometimes forget some of these things about economics?
Absolutely. Actually, all three of those things. I think sometimes, and maybe with a tweak, right, that economists look at the scope and they say, well, look, economics can be applied so broadly. Life actually is economics. So there's a pretty well-known pair of economists who have published, I don't know if they've done an academic journal article, I think just in the popular press, a statement of why, even though they've been together something like a decade and they have a child, they're not going to marry because they've done the calculation. And I just think that's the funniest thing, right? Economics is a study of human behavior. It's not to dictate what we should do. And it certainly doesn't replace other cultural, traditional, moral dimensions of how we make our choices. It's to help us understand human behavior, not to dictate what we should do. I think economists, that second point I made before, tend to think of economics as being technical and sometimes wear that as a badge of honor. And sometimes that comes with a degree of arrogance. And I think that's a misunderstanding. Economics is more than the technical, mathematical aspects. Finally, even economists can be convinced that morality is outside or totally irrelevant when it comes to economic discussions. Clearly, I don't believe that, and that's why I enjoy so much my involvement with the Acton Institute.
Increasingly, we're seeing socialism become more and more popular. In an article recently published on Fast Company, it says that a new Gallup poll demonstrates that Democratic socialist candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they're part of a larger shifting of thought. It says since 2010, Gallup has done a survey every 2 years of Americans' attitudes towards socialism, and we're mostly seeing a shift happen on the left. It says that socialism has become more popular since 2010. Back in 2010, 53% of liberals held a positive view of it, but now it's about 57%. Their estimation of capitalism, however, has plummeted because in 2016, 56% of people on the left thought well of capitalism, but now just 47% do. So I think increasingly we're seeing a lot of people want to stand with socialism because it sounds like a more inclusive, less greedy, more loving option. That's what it's being tailored as, especially as we're seeing so many people want to fight economic inequality these days, which isn't always a bad thing, but that is another conversation for another time.
That's a long conversation, a good one, though.
So basically, what are your thoughts on that people are wanting to stand with socialism because it sounds like a less greedy system?
I think there are a couple fundamental misunderstandings at the root of much of this. One is the facts. And I recognize this. For some, we'll distinguish between socialism and communism. Some of us would not draw such stark contrasts in ultimately where socialism leads, right? There's a discussion now, I was just catching up on it yesterday on Twitter about whether Venezuela is socialist, right? There are even people questioning that with the uprising that we see there. I think a just uprising for people that are living in very dire situations under a totalitarian regime. Certainly, I'm not saying that folks that would answer this way in a survey in the United States know that's where we're headed, and that's what they're hoping for. That's what they would push for. But I think there's a misunderstanding of the facts. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation has done a number of surveys of young people and what they think about communism. And I think the statistic is related to Stalin and George W. Bush. And what they found is that young people think that George W. Bush caused the death of more people than Stalin. Shocking, but telling, right? So we don't have facts. We don't learn from history. We also don't learn basic economics that tells us that good intentions are not sufficient. And I think a lot of this just comes from well-intentioned, justice-caring people that think free education, free healthcare means more people get education, more people get healthcare, more people learn and succeed, more people get improved health levels. All of those links in the logic have some economic issues. Economics would suggest that it's not as clear-cut as that, certainly. But in particular, this idea that an economic system of democratic socialism or kind of traditional socialism, certainly communism, can exist in practice for the people. We've not seen that happen in the past, and there's a reason. It's not because Stalin and Mao didn't do it right, that socialism, even in Europe, just isn't done right where it's done. It's that there are fundamental flaws. There are flaws in the way it expects people to behave. It thinks as malleable, that the human condition, that human nature is malleable. I understand the thinking of inclusivity, and I understand the pushback against our current kind of crony capitalist approach to things. But the fact is that socialism is exclusive. A people cannot make decisions about how to use each factor of production in the economy. We can't have a popular consensus on everything that goes on in a complex economy. And that means there's going to be a ruling class of people, and there will have to be political exclusion. There will have to be power differentials. There will be poverty.
Why should Christians care about this? I mean, I know that a lot of our listeners, especially who, listen to the Acton Institute podcast, they're coming from a faith-based background. So why does this matter with that in consideration?
I think the understanding broadly of economic systems and institutions, what we might narrowly consider economic institutions, but political institutions, just traditional institutions of oftentimes Western civilization is the way we think about it, but more broadly thinking about institutions and the environment that we operate in. Christians need to care about this. We have the biblical command, for example, to care for those at the margins, right? For those experiencing poverty. And when you look internationally at the experience with poverty, more often than not, in areas where poverty is persistent, generation after generation, there's political corruption. There's cronyism or totalitarianism. There's a breakdown in institutions that doesn't allow people access to markets. This is the, I think, major argument of the Poverty, Inc. film. I think Christians should care because we can continue to, this is a popular saying, walk alongside the poor, and we should. But really, one of the biggest factors in their ability to flourish is the economic and political environment that they operate in.
Sarah, once again, thank you for joining me on the podcast, and we are looking forward to hearing you on February 14th.
Thank you very much.
Join us in Grand Rapids to explore theology, philosophy, business, development, and market-based economics at the most unique conference in the Liberty Movement. During Acton University, the annual 4-day conference of the Acton Institute, you'll get to choose from over 100 courses and over 60 speakers, and connect with more than 1,000 people from all over the world. Come build the foundations of freedom with us and apply today at university.acton.org. That's university.acton.org.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Vanderput. I am the Poverty Initiatives Manager here at the Acton Institute. And today on the podcast, we have the pleasure of talking with Scott Sabin, Executive Director of Plant with Purpose, which is a partner of the Acton Institute's Poverty Cure Initiative. Scott has been a leading advocate for the rural poor and environmental stewardship for decades. He has led Plant with Purpose for 24 years and has overseen its expansion from working in one country to impacting more than 330 communities in 7 countries. He has also written a book called Tending to Eden, Environmental Stewardship for God's People. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure. I'm excited to be here with you.
So let's just jump right into it. Could you just briefly describe what Plant with Purpose does?
Sure. Plant with Purpose is a Christian nonprofit agency that works around the world in places where extreme poverty and environmental degradation intersect and interact. We're currently active in 8 different countries, serving approximately 200,000 people.
Now, I know you guys do saving groups, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, and we'll really focus in on that. But I'm curious about savings groups and the environment, and what do you see the connection between your environmental efforts and your efforts to address the problems that you see there with degradation? I imagine most people don't necessarily see material poverty and environmental damage as linked or intersecting in any way. Can you please explain how they are in fact linked?
Well, that was one of the earliest realizations of Plant with Purpose when we were trying to get at some of the root causes of rural poverty, to realize that a farmer is completely dependent on their land. For a subsistence farmer, their primary assets are their soil, their topsoil, and whatever water resources, whatever rain falls on that. And what we learned really early on is that those are very badly degraded by deforestation. When the trees are cut, the topsoil erodes away dramatically faster, leaving people trying to farm bedrock. And the water, the rain that falls, no longer infiltrates the soil, no longer recharges the aquifer, no longer waters their gardens, but instead runs off in flash floods. So that's one side of this vicious cycle, is that the environmental degradation was making them poorer. You can imagine what it's like to try and farm a steep, rocky hillside. And some of these places that people farm are almost unimaginably steep. You can imagine how difficult that would be. And then realizing that one of the biggest causes of environmental degradation that we were seeing was farmers forced out of desperation, forced because they had no other alternatives, to clear the rainforest, clear the land to farm in, to sell firewood or charcoal, and to farm in unsustainable ways. It's come home to me again and again that people who are desperate through their poverty make choices that may have a short-term benefit, but often can't afford to think about the long-term ramifications of their choices. And I've had people say that. When I go to Haiti and we talk about the environment, we talk about trees, I've had illiterate farmers tell me with more eloquence than an American ecology professor or biology teacher how a watershed functions and how the rainfall is impacted by the trees and how the rivers and streams are impacted by the trees. And they will always finish that with, but what else am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to feed my kids? So of course I'm making firewood. Of course I'm selling charcoal.
So what are the main factors that cause people to, engage in those slash and burn kind of tactics, or to clear land quickly? Is it just to kind of get some new arable land right away? What are the factors that, really influence them and encourage them or incentivize them even to engage in those efforts that are so degrading to the environment?
Well, a lot of times it's because they have intensively farmed very small pieces of land. We tend to focus on people who are farming steep hillsides where erosion is even more of a problem than it would be elsewhere. But one of the things that happens with deforestation is the topsoil erodes incredibly fast. If you think about a subsistence farmer, their 2 most important assets are their soil and whatever water resources, whatever rain falls on that soil. when the land around is deforested, it robs them of both of those assets. The topsoil erodes away incredibly fast. The rain no longer infiltrates the soil, no longer recharges the aquifer, and so they end up farming basically desert hillsides. And within only a couple of years, that's no longer sustainable, and so oftentimes they'll be looking for new land.
Well, let's kind of switch gears here and let's talk about the savings groups that I know you guys run. I know the idea of savings groups is essentially as old as the idea of money and mediums of exchange, really. It's not a model that, Plant with Purpose or any other partner of ours has created, but I know it's kind of grown in popularity, at least it seems it has here very recently. So could you just describe to us, to our listeners, what are savings groups and how does Plant with Purpose specifically run them?
We had been using a more traditional microfinance model for many years, and to be perfectly honest, not running it very efficiently because we were trying to do so many other things, and in some ways stumbled on this savings group model. And as I've said many times, I was a skeptic in the beginning. I saw these groups of 25 to 30, primarily women, coming together, saving 25 cents a week. And I remember asking our director in Tanzania, how is this going to amount to anything? It has turned out to have been revolutionary in what it's done, both for the communities we serve and for the efficiency of our own program. Basically, one of the fundamental differences between this and a more traditional model is we're not providing any capital. The group itself provides the capital. They meet weekly. We take them through a pretty intensive 12-week training program. During that time, they're saving and pooling their money and learning how to manage it. And when they begin to make microfinance or microcredit loans, those loans are at interest. The interest accrues to the savings of the people who are participating in the group. So in other words, instead of the interest coming back to us to cover our overhead, it helps individual savers to save at interest and is reinvested in that community. Again, having just watch it work, I've been amazed. Those groups starting with 25 cents or 40 cents a week have several $1,000s within a year. Very quickly, some of them have grown. I was with a group last year in Tanzania that started with 40 cents a share. They told me that they didn't believe that it would amount to much when they started. Here, 4 years later, their group had $20,000 in capital that belonged to them that they were loaning to their own members. They were regularly making loans of $1,000 to their own members. One of the group members told me how he had gone from he and his wife and 5 children living in a 2-room dirt floor hut to a 5-room brick house with a new roof and a cement floor in the course of 4 years as a result of the group.
What's the role of these people in their society, and what kind of authority do they typically have?
Well, it depends dramatically from country to country where we work, but you can generalize and say that women do not have a lot of authority. And one of the things that we've seen is this has been an opportunity for women to exercise leadership. We've measured a marked difference in women in leadership before and after in our work in Congo, for example. The people who are interested in this kind of thing are often the people who have been marginalized in one way or another. One of my favorite success stories is the story of a blind woman in Tanzania who, because the group had made a loan to her, the group was dependent on her success to see a return on their investment. They all came alongside her and helped her to become successful. And ultimately, not only was her business successful, but she became one of the leaders of the group.
That is awesome. That's a wonderful example. I mean, what's really amazing to me is that, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, the people that seem to make up these saving groups membership are probably some of the least empowered people on the planet. I mean, you were just mentioning the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I can't think of people with any less power, prestige, or position than agricultural women working on small farms in the Congo. But yet, through the fruit of their labor and through their creative capacity and their membership in this group, they're able to do some amazing things. which is just such an encouraging and a testament to what people can do when they're given the opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. If I could just add to that, I think there are a lot of things, a lot of people who are disempowered for one reason or another, but I think not only women, but also subsistence farmers in general, because I think there's a global perception that subsistence farmers are backwards. I hear it all the time here in the U.S., and we've gone through it here in the U.S., We've tried to bring people off the farm, and I get that all the time. They're going to be more productive if they can get jobs in the city. The world is moving towards urbanization. But yet there is a opportunity for creativity on a farm. It is a business. It just may not be a particularly successful business, and that's where we come in, is help that to become a more successful, more sustainable, better run business, better capitalized business through the savings groups.
So one of the things that we had talked about when we were discussing the idea of this podcast and whatnot was the fact that, through these savings groups and the training and whatnot, that you really saw even a cultural transformation occur within these communities that you were working in. Can you kind of describe a little bit more what that cultural transformation looked like?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is based on people who've been incredibly disempowered. We're talking about, oftentimes people who average barely one meal a day, people who are virtually excluded from the cash economy, who've been told by everyone, from the media to their own governments, that they have nothing to contribute, that they are worthless. And as they begin to experience small successes, and those small successes start in the savings groups and start in the agricultural training, we start with some fairly easy techniques that have some significant impact, and learn through our pastoral outreach that they have talents, that they have something to contribute. And very quickly it starts to build a self-confidence that wasn't there before, and a sense of agency, and a reduction. I guess fatalism is kind of often where people start from, and when they see that they can bring change on their own situation, it starts a chain reaction that has been phenomenal. One of the things we do in our Christian outreach is talk a lot about the value of work, the fact that work is actually a gift from God, that He's allowed us to participate in His redemptive work in the world. That has had some amazing impacts, in East Africa. We're working in Eastern Congo, and just a quick story. A couple years ago, I was talking with a young man who had spent the day walking with me, and I found out somewhere in the middle of the afternoon that he'd been a local militia leader or guerrilla leader. And so I asked if I could find out more about his story. And one of the things he said to me was, the men here didn't do much. We used to sit around and play cards most of the time. Then your pastor came and started talking about work being a privilege. And I thought, maybe if I help my wife on the farm, together we could do something really great. And then he goes on to talk about, being an advocate for peace and disarming the militia group. And so I'm wanting to get kind of at some of the spiritual roots of this. I said, so did you become a Christian then? And he gives me this funny look. He says, no, I've always been a Christian. It's just that I never knew it applied to anything besides Sunday before. I just got a recent report, same guy. I mean, he's one of nearly 15,000 people we're working with there in Eastern Congo. But, I just asked our director, how's he doing? Well, it turns out he's going community to community preaching peace. He has found purpose in Christ that he didn't have before, and I think a lot of that's come from seeing the fact that he can be successful in something.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for sharing about the savings groups. Again, it's just amazing to see what you guys are doing with that model and how people are responding. Again, just the fact that when we emphasize the material poor's creative capacity, their abilities, emphasize that and equip that and encourage them in that what they can do in and of themselves. And that's something I think a lesson that we in the nonprofit world really need to learn and take to heart as we seek to really address material poverty in a sustainable and dignity-affirming way. So thanks so much again for being with us. Really appreciate it. For those of you who didn't catch the organization that Scott works for, it's Plant with Purpose, and you can Google them and find out more about them pretty easily. But they do great work, and we're proud to have them as a Poverty Care partner. So Scott, thanks once again.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for listening today. If you want to learn more about the Acton Institute and what we do, visit our website at acton.org. That's acton.org. Please do not forget to share this episode with any friends and family you think would enjoy listening. Word of mouth is usually the primary source of growth for any podcast. Lastly, we want to hear from you, whether it's constructive criticism, a suggestion for a specific guest or topic, or if you just want to let us know that you like this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Leave us a message at 888-705-4180 or shoot us an email at actonline@acton.org.